I slid a single signed document across a polished oak table, and every person in the room suddenly forgot how to speak. No one shouted. No one stood up. Even the silverware seemed louder than the silence that followed. My mother-in-law had spent 9 years insisting my son wasn't real family. She repeated it at birthdays, holiday dinners, and even in front of strangers who didn't know us. Most people thought she was simply old-fashioned. A few believed she would eventually change. She never did. What none of them knew was that while everyone else had been arguing about blood, someone else had been quietly writing contracts. And contracts don't care about opinions. They only care about signatures. That piece of paper had waited inside a locked folder for nearly 6 years. Nobody in that dining room knew it existed, especially not the woman who had spent almost a decade trying to erase my little boy from our family story. She believed she had already won. She couldn't have been more wrong. But before I tell you what happened when that document reached the center of the table, you need to understand how we arrived there. Because buildings don't collapse because of one crack. They collapse because small cracks are ignored for years. Welcome back to Reality Drama Story, where family secrets unfold and quiet decisions change everything. If you're new here, drop a comment and subscribe. Now, let's get into it. My name is Emily. I'm 38 years old, an architect by profession, and the mother of the smartest 9-year-old boy I've ever met. His name is Noah. People often assume he's my biological son because he has my smile. He doesn't. Life simply has a strange sense of symmetry. I met Noah when he was barely 18 months old. His biological mother had passed away unexpectedly, and his father, Daniel, was trying to hold together a world that had fallen apart almost overnight. I wasn't looking for a relationship. Daniel wasn't looking either. We met because our architecture firms shared the same renovation project for an old library downtown. Our conversations started with blueprints, then coffee, then long evenings discussing everything except the things that hurt. Noah slowly became part of those conversations. The first time I met him, he handed me a toy dinosaur missing one leg. He looked at me very seriously and asked, "Can you fix him?" I couldn't, but I glued the broken leg back together the next day. He carried that dinosaur everywhere for almost 3 years. Sometimes love begins with impossible promises. Sometimes it begins with super glue. 3 years later, Daniel asked me to marry him. I never hesitated. When Noah was 4, I legally adopted him. The judge smiled while signing the adoption decree. She said something I've never forgotten. Families aren't discovered. They're built. As an architect, those words settled inside me like concrete. Buildings don't appear because someone wishes for them. Every beam is placed intentionally. Every foundation is measured twice before the first wall rises. Families deserve the same care. I thought everyone understood that. I was wrong. Daniel's mother, Margaret, attended our wedding wearing a pearl necklace that she adjusted every time someone mentioned Noah. She was always perfectly polite. That made everything worse. Cruelty wrapped inside perfect manners is difficult to confront. You start questioning whether you imagined it. At first, the comments were almost invisible. She introduced me as Daniel's wife. Then she'd introduce Noah by saying, "Daniel's late wife's little boy." Never our grandson. Never simply Noah. Always a reminder that he came from somewhere else. Daniel corrected her. Every single time. She smiled. She apologized. Then she repeated it the following week. Little by little, language became a fence. Most people never noticed. Children always do. By the time Noah turned 6, he had started asking careful questions. Why does Grandma Margaret always say I belong to someone else? Children don't ask questions because they lack intelligence. They ask because they already know the answer and hope you'll tell them they're wrong. I knelt beside him. You belong exactly where you're loved. He nodded. But children remember tone more than words. Margaret never raised her voice. She simply measured every sentence as though she were slowly removing bricks from a wall nobody else realized was supporting the house. There was one person who kept me grounded through those years. My grandfather, Walter. He had built houses for 48 years. Not luxury homes. Ordinary neighborhoods. Ordinary families. Extraordinary craftsmanship. He used to tell me, "You can judge a builder by the parts nobody sees." He wasn't talking about wood. He was talking about character. When I was 11, I accidentally ruined one of his expensive measuring tapes. I cried for an hour because I thought he'd be angry. Instead, he placed the broken tape measure on his workbench. Then he picked up a pencil. "Emily," he said, "tools can be replaced. Trust takes longer." Those words followed me into adulthood. Whenever someone disappointed me, I remembered that workshop smelling of fresh pine and coffee. Grandpa Walter passed away 2 years before I married Daniel. I still carry his old carpenter's pencil inside my desk drawer. It's worn down to barely 3 inches. I can't use it anymore. I simply keep it, not because it builds anything, because it reminds me how things should be built. Margaret never openly attacked me. Instead, she specialized in tiny exclusions: Christmas stockings, family photographs, birthday speeches. Whenever gifts were distributed, Noah's always appeared last. Sometimes she'd laugh and say, "Oh goodness, I almost forgot." Once is forgetfulness. 7 consecutive Christmases become a decision. Daniel confronted her repeatedly. She always had explanations. "I'm getting older. I was distracted. You two are too sensitive." Eventually, even relatives began pretending not to notice. Silence is remarkably efficient at protecting bad behavior. Then came the family business. Daniel's father, Richard, had spent 40 years building Harrison Industrial Supply, a regional construction materials company worth several $1,000,000. Unlike Margaret, Richard spoke very little. He observed, measured, listened. He reminded me of structural engineers I'd worked beside. They rarely interrupted meetings. But when they finally spoke, everyone reached for a notebook. Richard loved Noah without ceremony. No dramatic speeches. No social media photographs. Every Saturday morning they ate pancakes together at exactly 8 o'clock. No exceptions. After breakfast, they visited the warehouse. Richard taught Noah how concrete was mixed, how steel beams were rated, how invoices mattered because promises mattered. One Saturday, I arrived early to pick Noah up. I found Richard teaching him how to read an old blueprint. Noah frowned. "This line looks crooked." Richard smiled. "It only looks crooked because you're standing in the wrong place." I never forgot that sentence. Perspective changes everything. Margaret hated those Saturdays. She never said so directly. But whenever Richard praised Noah, her smile tightened just enough for anyone paying attention. Once she said, "Richard, don't spoil the boy." Richard looked up from his coffee. "I'm teaching my grandson." Her face remained perfectly still, but something inside her shifted. I saw it. The room suddenly felt colder. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't simply about old traditions. Margaret genuinely believed family could only travel through biology. Love didn't count. Promises didn't count. Adoption certainly didn't count. And once a belief like that settles into someone's foundation, they stop seeing people. They only see bloodlines. Daniel continued hoping time would soften her. I continued hoping kindness would. Richard simply watched. Quietly. Carefully. Like a man inspecting a building before deciding whether the damage was cosmetic or hidden deep inside the foundation. The first real crack appeared on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. It wasn't Christmas. It wasn't Thanksgiving. There wasn't even an argument. Sometimes the moments that change a family don't arrive with shouting. They arrive wrapped inside ordinary conversations. Richard had invited everyone to his house for lunch. The dining room overlooked the backyard where Noah was trying to teach his cousin Emma how to build a birdhouse from leftover pieces of wood. Richard watched through the window with quiet pride. "He measures twice before he cuts," Richard said with a smile. "That's a good habit." Margaret didn't even look outside. "He's learning from watching," she replied. Richard nodded. "He certainly is." Then Margaret added 6 words that changed the atmosphere of the room. "Watching isn't the same as belonging." The conversation stopped. Daniel slowly put down his fork. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Margaret sighed as though she were the one being misunderstood. "I'm simply saying that traditions belong to blood." Richard looked at her. "Our family isn't a museum." She smiled politely. "No, Richard. It has rules." No one answered. Outside, Noah laughed because the roof of the little birdhouse had fallen off. Inside, the silence lasted almost 30 seconds. I counted every one of them. After lunch, Richard asked if I could stay behind for coffee. Daniel took Noah home. Margaret left without saying goodbye. Richard poured 2 cups of black coffee into heavy ceramic mugs that looked older than I was. He sat at the kitchen table. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. Then he opened a small notebook. "I owe you an apology." I shook my head. "You don't." "Yes," he replied quietly. "I've watched this continue longer than I should have." His voice wasn't emotional. It was factual, like someone reviewing an inspection report. I thought she'd eventually stop. So did I. He looked out the window. "She won't." That afternoon, Richard asked me something unexpected. "If anything ever happened to me, would you protect Noah?" I almost laughed. "Of course." He nodded. "I know, but I mean legally." That single word lingered between us. Legally. I worked around contracts every week. Construction projects depended on them. A handshake builds trust. A signature protects it. Richard reached into a cabinet and removed a blue folder. Not thick, maybe 20 pages. Every sheet neatly organized. He slid it across the table but didn't open it. "I've started updating my estate plan." I looked at him. He continued. "I wanted to make sure every grandchild is treated equally." I noticed something. He didn't say biological grandchild. He simply said grandchild. There was a difference. A very important one. "I don't want assumptions after I'm gone," he said. "I want instructions." Over the next several months, Richard occasionally asked me questions. Nothing dramatic. Dates, addresses, school records, copies of Noah's adoption decree, proof that Daniel and I had been his legal parents for years. At first, I assumed he was simply organizing paperwork. Then one afternoon, he asked whether I could recommend an attorney experienced in family trusts. I gave him the name of the law firm our company occasionally worked with. He thanked me. That was all. He never discussed it again. I respected that. Some conversations don't need spectators. Life moved forward. Noah turned 8. Daniel accepted a promotion. I completed the design of a community library that had taken nearly 3 years to finish. Grandpa Walter used to say a building reveals its strength during bad weather. Families do the same. The storm arrived in the form of Richard's health. It began with exhaustion, then medical appointments, then words none of us wanted to hear. Heart failure. Manageable, but serious. Richard accepted the diagnosis with remarkable calm. He reduced his hours at the company, started spending even more Saturdays with Noah. The 2 of them built model bridges in the garage, each one labeled with the date they finished it. Bridge number 1, bridge number 2. By the time Richard completed his 12th bridge, Noah had learned more about patience than most adults. Margaret disliked those Saturdays more than ever. She began inviting Daniel's sister and her children over at the same time. She wanted photographs, family pictures, every frame carefully arranged. One afternoon, I walked into the living room carrying lemonade. The photographer asked, Should Noah stand with the cousins? Before I could answer, Margaret spoke. Oh. He can stand on the side. On the side. Not with the grandchildren. On the side. The photographer looked uncomfortable. Daniel immediately moved beside Noah. If Noah isn't in the middle, he said calmly. I'm not in the picture. His sister followed. So am I. Even the cousins refused to move. Margaret finally gave in. The picture was taken, but she never displayed it. Months later, I discovered why. She had ordered another print, one where Noah had been digitally removed. I found it by accident while looking for wrapping paper in the hallway closet. I stared at it for several seconds. The empty space beside Daniel looked unnatural, like a doorway bricked over after the house had already been finished. I quietly placed the photograph back exactly where I had found it. Some evidence doesn't need an audience immediately. Sometimes it simply needs to wait. Richard passed away 11 months later. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning. No dramatic last words. No hospital speeches. Daniel held his father's hand. I sat beside Noah in the waiting room drawing bridges on a sheet of paper because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. He was 9 years old. Children understand death differently. They measure absence in routines. No more Saturday pancakes. No more blueprints. No more garage projects. No more quiet voice saying, measure twice. At the funeral, Noah placed one of their small wooden bridges inside Richard's casket. No one told him to. He simply said, so Grandpa won't have to build alone. Even the minister paused after hearing those words. The weeks following the funeral felt strangely organized. Richard had always planned ahead. Every account was documented. Every insurance policy labeled. Every company record updated. His attorney contacted the family. The formal estate meeting would take place exactly 30 days after the funeral. Standard procedure. Margaret immediately began talking about inheritances. Not greedily, matter-of-factly, almost as though certain outcomes had already been decided. The business should stay with blood, she said one evening. She didn't look at Noah. She didn't need to. Everyone knew who she meant. Daniel answered quietly, the business belongs to Dad's wishes. Margaret smiled. I'm sure Richard understood family. Daniel didn't respond. Neither did I. Some arguments are better postponed until everyone has access to the same documents. 3 days before the attorney's meeting, I received a phone call. The caller identified himself as Mr. Ellis, Richard's estate attorney. I'd like you to come by the office tomorrow morning. I frowned. Is something wrong? No. I simply need one signature before the family meeting. One signature. Those words sounded surprisingly ordinary, yet something about his tone suggested otherwise. The next morning, I arrived at his office precisely at 10. Mr. Ellis greeted me warmly. He closed the office door. Then he unlocked a filing cabinet. Inside sat a single navy blue folder with Richard Harrison's name embossed in gold lettering. Mr. Ellis placed it carefully on the desk. Richard instructed me, he said, that this folder was not to be opened until this appointment. He looked directly at me. And only in your presence. I felt my heart beat slow instead of speed up. Architects learn early that rushing leads to mistakes. So I waited. Mr. Ellis opened the folder. Inside were several legal documents. Trust amendments. Corporate records. Letters. And finally, one sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Richard's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 simple words. For Emily. Open before everyone arrives. I looked at Mr. Ellis. He simply nodded. Richard was very specific. With careful hands, I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. And beneath that letter, one signed document. The document that would eventually leave an entire dining room completely silent. For a few seconds, I didn't read the legal document. I read Richard's letter first. His handwriting was as steady as I remembered. Every line was straight. every word carefully spaced, just like the notes he used to leave on blueprints. The letter began simply, "Emily, if you're reading this, it means my family is about to face a test that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with character." I swallowed hard. The office suddenly felt much quieter. Richard continued, "You've never asked me for anything. Not once. You loved my grandson before the law called him your son. And you loved him exactly the same after it did. That tells me everything I need to know about you." I paused. My eyes blurred for just a moment. Then I kept reading. People often confuse biology with responsibility. Biology creates possibility. Responsibility creates family. There was one final paragraph. Inside this folder is the document I signed on March 14th, 2020. I have kept it private because I wanted it judged by its purpose, not by anyone's opinion. If the time comes, let it speak for me. I folded the letter carefully. Mr. Ellis slid the legal document toward me. "This is the paper Richard wanted you to sign today." I looked at the title, Acceptance of Successor Trustee. I frowned. "I don't understand." Mr. Ellis adjusted his glasses. "You will." He opened another page. Richard had created a family trust 6 years earlier. Everything of significance had been transferred into it. The company shares, the investment accounts, the commercial properties, even the family lake house. Nothing was left outside the trust except personal belongings. Then Mr. Ellis showed me the clause Richard had personally requested. He pointed to one paragraph. "Please read this." I did. Once. Then again. The words were simple. Every legally adopted descendant of the Harrison family shall possess the same rights, protections, inheritance, and opportunities as any biological descendant, without exception or limitation. Below it was Richard's signature, the signatures of 2 witnesses, a notary seal, the date, March 14th, 2020, 6 years earlier, long before anyone expected him to become seriously ill. Long before the arguments became impossible to ignore, Richard had already solved the problem. Quietly, legally, permanently. Mr. Ellis smiled. Richard believed that families should never depend on people's moods. They should depend on principles. Then he pointed toward the final page. As successor trustee, your signature simply confirms that you accept the responsibility of carrying out his instructions exactly as written. I signed. One signature. One date. Less than 30 seconds. The paper that had taken Richard months to design took me half a minute to complete. That afternoon, the entire family gathered in the conference room of Harrison Industrial Supply. The long oak table Richard loved had been polished until it reflected the ceiling lights. There were 12 chairs, every one of them occupied. Margaret sat nearest the window, Daniel beside me, his sister, Laura, across from us, the company accountant, Mr. Ellis, 2 senior executives, 3 cousins, and Noah. He sat quietly with a small notebook in his lap. He had brought Grandpa Richard's old mechanical pencil, the same one Richard always carried in his shirt pocket. Noah held it carefully, almost respectfully. Mr. Ellis began reading the estate documents. The first 30 minutes were routine. Insurance, savings, charitable donations, the family cabin. Everything proceeded exactly as expected. Margaret relaxed a little more with every page. She smiled politely. Occasionally she nodded. Then the trust documents began. Mr. Ellis's tone changed. He became slower, more deliberate. He explained that Richard had transferred nearly all major assets into the Harrison family trust years earlier. Margaret interrupted. "I don't remember discussing that." Mr. Ellis answered calmly. "You were not required to." The room became noticeably quieter. He continued. "The trust owns 82% of Harrison Industrial Supply." The accountant confirmed the figure. 82.4%, he said. Margaret straightened in her chair. So the shares passed to Daniel. Mr. Ellis looked down. No, they remain inside the trust. She blinked. What? The trust continues. As instructed by Richard Harrison. Her smile disappeared. He continued reading. Income distributions. Maintenance of company operations. Scholarship funding. Employee bonuses. Everything carefully organized. Then he reached the paragraph. The paragraph. The one Richard had written 6 years earlier. Mr. Ellis read every word slowly. Every legally adopted descendant of the Harrison family shall possess the same rights, protections, inheritance, and opportunities as any biological descendant, without exception or limitation. Silence! Real silence. Not uncomfortable conversation. Absolute silence. I counted 8 full seconds. Margaret finally laughed. A short laugh. Confident. Well, she said, that doesn't apply. No one answered. She looked around the table. Daniel only has one adopted child. Still silence. Then Mr. Ellis opened another folder. It applies directly. He placed Noah's certified adoption decree beside the trust document. The legal relationship was established 5 years before this amendment. Margaret stared at the papers. I don't accept that. Mr. Ellis remained perfectly calm. The law already has. Her eyes shifted toward Daniel. You aren't going to let this happen. Daniel answered without raising his voice. It already happened. Years ago. She looked at Laura. You agree with me? Laura slowly shook her head. No. I agree with Dad. Margaret's voice became sharper. This isn't what family means. I still hadn't spoken. I simply watched, just as I had watched for 9 years. Mr. Ellis turned one more page. As successor trustee, responsibility now transfers to Emily Harrison. Every head turned toward me, including Margaret's. Her expression changed instantly. First anger, then disbelief, then calculation. Finally, a smile that looked carefully rehearsed. Oh, Emily, I'm sure we can discuss this privately. I folded my hands on the table. There's nothing to discuss. You've misunderstood. I don't think I have. I was emotional. For 9 years. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then tears appeared. Perfectly timed. I've just struggled since losing Daniel's first wife. I never meant to hurt anyone. I looked toward Noah. He wasn't watching Margaret. He was tracing circles on Grandpa Richard's old pencil. Quietly, patiently, waiting. I spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Richard explained something to me once. Everyone listened. He said concrete doesn't crack because of one winter. It cracks after years of freezing and thawing. I looked back at Margaret. This wasn't one mistake. It was years. Christmases, birthdays, family photographs, comments, corrections, and choices. No anger, just facts. Margaret whispered. I said I was sorry. Before I could answer, someone else spoke. It was George, Richard's oldest friend. He had served on the company's board for over 20 years. He rarely interrupted anyone. His voice was quiet. Margaret. She looked at him. I worked beside Richard for 4 decades. I know exactly why he wrote that clause. She didn't answer. George continued. He wasn't protecting money. He was protecting a little boy. The room fell silent again. No one disagreed, because no one could. The meeting ended 43 minutes later. No arguments. No lawsuits. Richard's paperwork had been too thorough. Every signature had been witnessed. Every document notarized. Every date verified. There was nothing to challenge. Sometimes preparation ends conflicts before they begin. Over the following 60 days, the transition was completed. The trust continued operating exactly as Richard intended. Daniel became president of the company. Laura remained chief financial officer. I accepted my responsibilities as trustee. Employee salaries never changed. Operations continued normally. The annual scholarship Richard had started for trade school students expanded from $10,000 to $25,000. It was written into the trust, so we honored it. Noah didn't suddenly become wealthy in the way people imagine. His inheritance remained protected inside the trust until adulthood. Richard believed children should inherit opportunity before money. I agreed. 3 months later, Noah asked if we could visit Grandpa Richard's favorite park. We carried a small wooden bridge. Bridge number 13. He had built it himself. The measurements weren't perfect. One side leaned slightly. He placed it beneath a large oak tree where Richard used to sit with him. Then he reached into his backpack. He removed Grandpa Walter's old carpenter's pencil, the one I had carried for years. I think Grandpa Richard would want him to have this, I whispered. Noah accepted it carefully. He placed Walter's pencil beside Richard's mechanical pencil inside the small wooden box he kept in his room. 2 pencils. From 2 builders. One built houses. One built a family. Sometimes the smallest objects carry the greatest weight. Margaret eventually moved to a smaller condominium across town. We spoke occasionally. Birthdays. Holiday cards. Brief conversations. She was always polite, but something had changed. Not in the documents. Not in the law. In her understanding. One afternoon, nearly a year later, she attended Noah's school science fair. He had built a bridge using popsicle sticks. She stood quietly in front of it for several minutes. Finally, she looked at him and said, "Your grandfather would have been proud." Noah smiled. "So am I." He didn't ask which grandfather. He didn't need to. Both. People often ask whether I feel like I won. I always answer the same way. There was never a competition. Richard simply refused to leave love dependent on someone's opinion. He put it where opinions couldn't reach it. On paper. With signatures. With witnesses. With the law. The truth is that signed document didn't create our family. It only protected the family we had already spent years building. And every time I see Noah carefully measuring a piece of wood before making the first cut, I remember both Richard and my grandfather. Strong foundations aren't poured in a single day. They're built one careful decision at a time. This wasn't revenge. It was the blueprint of a promise kept. If this story reminded you to know your worth, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, drop a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.